an extremist leader squeezed the Beatles records in a public square. Lennon didn't live, and the whole country stopped breathing. Birmingham, Alabama, August 1966. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Lynn Park, turning the concrete plaza into a furnace that radiated heat in visible waves. But the temperature of the weather was nothing compared to the temperature of what was about to happen in that public square. Reverend Tommy Maddox stood on a makeshift wooden platform, his white suit somehow immaculate despite the oppressive heat, his silver hair perfectly combed, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who believed he was about to perform an act of divine justice. Behind him, stacked in careful pyramids that rose nearly 6 feet high, were thousands of vinyl records. Beatles albums, Beatles singles. Anything that bore the image or sound of the 4 young men from Liverpool who had, in Reverend Maddox's considered theological opinion, committed the most dangerous form of blasphemy possible in the American South of 1966. They had claimed to be bigger than Jesus Christ. The crowd that filled Lynn Park that afternoon was unlike anything Birmingham had seen since the civil rights demonstrations 3 years earlier. But this gathering had a different quality, a different temperature. The civil rights marches had carried the weight of people demanding justice. This crowd carried something else entirely, and religious fury mixed with cultural rage, the specific combustible combination of people who felt their deepest beliefs had been publicly mocked by 4 young men who had gotten too famous for their own good. Reverend Maddox was 62 years old. He had built his reputation across 3 decades of passionate, uncompromising sermons that attracted followers from across the Deep South. His radio program reached 14 states. His monthly newsletter had 40,000 subscribers. And he was not a fringe figure. He was, within his particular segment of American Christianity, a voice of considerable authority. Birmingham, Alabama, 1966, public square crowd gathering. When John Lennon's comment about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus had appeared in the London Evening Standard, it had taken several months to make its way across the Atlantic. But when it did, when it was reprinted in the American teen magazine Datebook, it landed in the American South like a match dropped into gasoline. Radio stations had banned Beatles music. Churches had organized protests. Teenagers had been forbidden by parents to attend Beatles concerts. And Reverend Tommy Maddox had seen an opportunity. Not just to express his outrage, anyone could do that, but to channel that outrage into something visible, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. Something that would send a message not just to John Lennon, but to the broader culture of celebrity worship that Maddox believed was corrupting the moral foundation of American youth. A public burning, a bonfire, a deliberate ritualistic destruction of Beatles records in front of as many witnesses as possible. He had spent 2 weeks organizing the event. He had used his radio program to announce it. He had contacted newspapers and television stations. He had printed flyers and distributed them through church networks across Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Tennessee. "Bring your Beatles records," the flyers had read. "Bring your children. Come witness the proper response to blasphemy delivered with a British accent." The crowd that answered that call numbered in the thousands, families with coolers and folding chairs as if they were attending a church picnic, teenagers who had been ordered by their parents to bring their Beatles albums, their children too young to understand what was happening but old enough to sense the particular electricity of adult anger organized around a specific target. And scattered throughout the crowd, carrying cameras and recording equipment, were representatives from every major news organization in the region: CBS, NBC, ABC, the Associated Press, Time magazine, Newsweek, because everybody understood, including Reverend Maddox, that what was about to happen in Lynn Park would not remain in Lynn Park. That the images of thousands of Beatles records burning in an Alabama public square would appear on front pages and television broadcasts across the country and around the world. That John Lennon, wherever he was, would see it. What nobody in Lynn Park could have predicted was what John Lennon would do when he saw it, or the effect that his response would have on a country that was about to stop breathing for reasons none of them could have imagined. London, the same afternoon. John Lennon sat in his Weybridge home, watching the BBC Evening News with the sound turned down. He was not watching because he expected to see anything particular. He was watching because he had developed the habit, over the previous 6 months, of monitoring how badly things were going in America. Ever since the Jesus comment, the comment itself had been made during a routine interview with Maureen Cleave of the London Evening Standard in March, and John had been discussing the decline of Christianity among young people, the way churches were emptying while concert halls were filling, the particular irony of the Beatles attracting more passionate devotion than religious services. "We're more popular than Jesus now," he had said, not boasting, observing, making a sociological point about the shifting nature of cultural influence in the modern world. In London, the comment had generated some discussion, but no particular outrage, and British journalists and readers understood it in the context John had intended, as cultural commentary, as an observation about the changing relationship between entertainment and religion in contemporary society. In America, where the comment had appeared 3 months later in Datebook magazine, it was read very differently, as an attack, as arrogance, as a personal insult to Jesus Christ delivered by a young man who had gotten rich and famous and forgotten his place in the divine order of things. John had watched the American reaction with a combination of fascination and growing dread. Radio stations banning Beatles music, churches organizing boycotts, mayors cancelling concerts, death threats arriving at the Beatles' management offices with disturbing frequency. He had initially resisted calls to apologize or clarify, and not because he wasn't sorry about the misunderstanding. He was genuinely sorry that people had been hurt by something he had meant as social observation, not religious provocation, but because he understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had always been his most valuable survival skill, that apologizing would not solve the problem. It would simply move the conversation from what he had said to how sorry he was for saying it. And that conversation, he knew, would be even more impossible to win. So he had said nothing. For 3 months, he had watched the American reaction from across the Atlantic and said nothing. Until this afternoon. This afternoon, the BBC Evening News had led with footage from Birmingham, Alabama. Reverend Tommy Maddox addressing a crowd of thousands, pyramids of Beatles records stacked for burning, and children holding signs that read, "Beatles go home" and "Jesus is King." And then the moment that would be replayed on television broadcasts around the world for the next week. Reverend Maddox lifting a copy of Revolver, the Beatles' newest album, above his head, his voice amplified by loudspeakers carrying across Lynn Park with the particular authority of a man who believed he was speaking on behalf of God. "John Lennon," Maddox had declared, "you said you were bigger than Jesus. Let's see how big you are when this is all that's left of you." He had squeezed the record between his hands. The vinyl, heated by the Alabama sun, had cracked with a sound that the television microphones captured with perfect clarity, a sharp, brittle snap that seemed to echo across the plaza. The crowd had roared its approval, and Reverend Maddox had thrown the broken pieces onto the pile of records that would, within the hour, be set ablaze. And John watched this footage with his face completely expressionless. Then he turned off the television. He walked to the kitchen. He made a cup of tea. He sat down at the kitchen table. And he made a decision that would change everything that followed. He was going to America. Not for the planned Beatles tour, which had been postponed indefinitely due to the hostile response to his comment. He was going alone, unannounced, without management, without security. He was going to find Reverend Tommy Maddox, and he was going to do something that nobody, not the Beatles management, not the American media, not the religious communities calling for boycotts, and certainly not Reverend Maddox himself, would expect. He was going to sit down with the man who had just broken his record on television. And he was going to have a conversation. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. Birmingham, Alabama. 3 days later, the Redmont Hotel. Downtown, Birmingham's most prestigious establishment. An elegant brick building that had housed presidents and senators and business titans for nearly half a century. Its lobby was designed to project the particular kind of Southern sophistication that announced, without saying so directly, that serious people conducted serious business within its walls. Now at 2:17 in the afternoon, John Lennon walked through the front door. He was alone. He carried a single suitcase. He wore jeans, a white button-down shirt, and dark sunglasses. He had no entourage, no security, no managers. He looked to the desk clerk who checked him in under the name Mr. Winston, like a college student with enough money for a nice hotel room. The desk clerk had no idea he had just registered the most famous musician in the world. The man whose records had been burned in Lynn Park 3 days earlier. The man whose comment about Jesus had generated more hate mail than anyone in Birmingham could remember receiving about anything. John's plan was simple, in the way that the most audacious plans often are. He was going to call Reverend Maddox's church. He was going to identify himself. He was going to request a meeting. And then he was going to sit in a room with the man who had publicly crushed his record and attempt to have the conversation that should have happened before any records were burned. He understood that this plan contained several significant risks, that Reverend Maddox might refuse to meet with him. That word of his presence in Birmingham might leak to the media or to the kinds of people who had been sending death threats. That the meeting, if it happened, might go very badly indeed. He also understood that the potential consequences of doing nothing were worse than the risks of doing something that had never been tried before. That evening, after dark, John called the number listed in the phone book for First Baptist Church of Greater Birmingham. Reverend Maddox answered the phone himself. Reverend Maddox, John said, his Liverpool accent immediately identifiable even over a crackling long-distance connection. "Oh, this is John Lennon." The silence that followed lasted nearly 15 seconds. "I beg your pardon," Reverend Maddox said finally. "John Lennon," John repeated. "The Beatle, the one who said the thing about Jesus that upset you so much. I'm in Birmingham. I'd like to talk to you." Another silence, shorter this time, but carrying a quality of complete stillness that suggested Reverend Maddox was recalibrating everything he thought he knew about what was happening in his life. "Where are you?" he asked. "The Redmont Hotel," John said. "Room 412. I came alone. No reporters, no cameras, no management, just me. And I think we need to have a conversation. What kind of conversation? John considered the question. Through the hotel room window, he could see the lights of Birmingham spreading across the Alabama Valley. Somewhere out there were thousands of people who 3 days earlier had cheered as his records burned. And somewhere out there were other thousands who loved the Beatles' music and were probably afraid to say so. The kind, John said, where we figure out whether we actually disagree about the important things or whether we just disagree about the words. Reverend Maddox was quiet for a long time. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. "Room 412 at the Redmont Hotel, 9:30 p.m. Two men sat across from each other, in chairs that had been moved to face each other directly. Between them, a small table held a pitcher of water and 2 glasses. Nothing else. No tape recorders, no cameras, no witnesses. John Lennon and Reverend Tommy Maddox. They had been talking for an hour. It had not gone as either man had expected. Reverend Maddox had arrived prepared for confrontation. He had expected to meet the arrogant young rock star he had constructed in his mind based on John's comment and the Beatles' general reputation, and someone who would defend the Jesus comment with the casual blasphemy of a generation that had rejected traditional values. Instead, he had found a man who seemed genuinely interested in understanding why the comment had caused such pain, who listened with the attention of someone trying to solve a problem rather than win an argument, who asked questions about Maddox's faith that were serious questions, not challenges disguised as questions. John, for his part, one had expected to meet a religious fanatic, someone whose opposition to the Beatles came from the kind of narrow, fearful fundamentalism that saw threats to Christianity everywhere and responded to those threats with automatic hostility. Instead, he had found a man whose faith was clearly genuine and deeply felt, who could articulate, with considerable thoughtfulness, and exactly why the idea of anyone claiming to be bigger than Jesus struck him as both spiritually dangerous and culturally destructive. "The thing is," Reverend Maddox was saying, leaning forward in his chair, "when young people hear someone they admire saying that a rock band is more popular than Jesus, what they hear is permission to treat religion as if it's just another form of entertainment. Something you can choose or not choose based on what's fashionable." John nodded. But that's not what I meant. What I meant was that something's wrong if a rock band can fill a stadium and a church can't fill its pews, that the church has lost something, not that the church doesn't matter. "But how are 16-year-olds supposed to know that?" Maddox asked. "How are they supposed to understand the difference between sociological observation and spiritual instruction?" "They're not," John admitted. "That's on me. I said something that could be misunderstood, and I said it publicly, and I didn't think about who might be listening." The conversation had been proceeding like this for the full hour. Two intelligent men discovering that their actual positions were much closer than their public positions suggested. That the real disagreement was not about the importance of faith or the responsibility of public figures, but about how to address the cultural changes that were affecting both. "What I don't understand," John said, "is the burning. The records, I mean. Destroying things that people made. That doesn't seem, what's the word you'd use? Christian." Reverend Maddox was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something that hadn't been there earlier in the conversation, a quality of uncertainty. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "since it happened, whether it was the right thing to do. And I think I was angry," Maddox said slowly. "I think I heard what you said. And I felt like something I care about very much was being attacked, and I wanted to attack back. But that's not the same as doing the right thing." John leaned back in his chair. This was the opening he had hoped for, but hadn't expected to receive. What if, he said, instead of attacking back, we did something else? What kind of something else? John had been thinking about this question for 3 days, during the flight from London, during the registration at the hotel, and during the hour of conversation that had led to this moment. What if, he said, we did a concert? Reverend Maddox looked at him blankly. Not a Beatles concert, John continued. Something different. You and me, on the same stage, in front of your people and mine. And we have this conversation in front of them, the real conversation, about faith and culture and responsibility and how to bridge the gap instead of making it wider. That's impossible, Maddox said immediately. But why? Because, Maddox started to answer, then stopped. He was quiet for nearly a minute. Because it's never been done. Exactly, John said. Birmingham Municipal Auditorium, 1 week later. The building was full beyond its official capacity. Every seat taken, people standing in the aisles, others pressed against the walls of the lobby, straining to hear whatever was going to happen on the stage inside. The audience was unlike anything Birmingham had ever contained. Religious families who had attended the record burning the previous week sat next to teenagers who owned every Beatles album. Church ministers shared rows with civil rights activists. College students sat beside their grandparents. People who agreed about nothing except their curiosity about what would happen when John Lennon and Reverend Tommy Maddox shared a stage. The national media was present in numbers that Birmingham had not seen since the worst days of the civil rights struggles. CBS, RNBC, ABC, every major newspaper, magazine crews from Time and Newsweek, radio correspondents from coast to coast. Because everyone understood that this was either going to be extraordinary or catastrophic, that the combination of John Lennon's celebrity, Reverend Maddox's religious authority, the recent record burning, and the racial and cultural tensions of Birmingham in 1966 could produce something unprecedented, or it could produce a riot. The stage setup was deliberately simple: 2 chairs and 2 microphones, a small table between them, no bands, no elaborate staging, no anything that might distract from what would be, essentially, a public conversation between 2 men who had spent the previous week discovering they disagreed about less than either had expected. At 8 p.m. precisely, Reverend Maddox walked onto the stage. He wore a dark suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his face carrying the expression of a man who was not entirely certain what he had agreed to do, but was committed to doing it as honorably as possible. The applause from his supporters was enthusiastic, but restrained. The silence from the rest of the audience was complete. At 8:03, John Lennon walked onto the stage. He wore jeans and a white shirt. No jacket, no tie, no concession to the formality of the venue or the occasion. He carried an acoustic guitar, which had not been part of the announced program. The sound that moved through the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium at his appearance was unlike anything the building had ever contained. Not applause exactly, not booing exactly. A sound that contained every possible response to John Lennon's presence in that place, at that time, under those circumstances. The 2 men shook hands at center stage. They sat down in the chairs. They adjusted their microphones. And then John Lennon did something that no one in the auditorium, including Reverend Maddox, had expected. He began to pray, out loud, into his microphone, in front of 4,000 people and a dozen television cameras. God, he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the auditorium. I don't know if I do this right. I don't know if I believe all the right things or say all the right words, but I know I said something that hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt. And I know that needs to be addressed before anything else can happen here." The auditorium was absolutely still. "So, if you're listening," John continued, "help us figure out how to talk to each other about the things that matter without making the things that matter into weapons we use against each other." He looked up from his hands, which had been folded while he spoke. He looked at Reverend Maddox. "Amen," Reverend Maddox said quietly, and 4,000 people who had come expecting a debate heard instead the beginning of something that none of them had imagined possible. What happened over the next 2 hours in the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium was broadcast live on all 3 television networks and dozens of radio stations across the United States, which meant that millions of Americans, from living rooms and kitchen tables and transistor radios in cars parked outside the auditorium, witnessed something that had never occurred before in the history of American public discourse: a genuine conversation about faith and fame and responsibility and forgiveness between 2 public figures who had every reason to treat each other as enemies and had chosen instead to treat each other as human beings trying to solve a common problem. John and Reverend Maddox talked about the Jesus comment, not defensively, not accusingly, but with the shared goal of understanding how communication could go so badly wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. They talked about the responsibility of public figures. John acknowledged that his words carried weight beyond his intentions. Reverend Maddox acknowledged that his response to those words had been driven more by anger than by wisdom. They talked about young people, about the cultural changes that were frightening to older generations and exciting to younger ones, about how to bridge that gap instead of widening it. 30 minutes into the conversation, John picked up his guitar. "I'd like to play something," he said. "Not a Beatles song. Something I wrote after we talked last week, after you helped me understand something I hadn't understood before." He began to play, a simple melody carried by gentle finger-picking, over which he sang lyrics that he had written during the previous week of preparation for this evening. And the song was called Common Ground. It was about the discovery that people who seem to disagree about everything often share the same fundamental concerns, that the gap between positions is often smaller than the gap between the languages used to express those positions. We're all trying to find something worth believing in. We're all trying to build something worth defending. We're all trying to say something worth hearing. Maybe we're not as far apart as we're pretending. The Birmingham Municipal Auditorium listened in absolute silence. The television cameras captured not just the performance, but the faces of the audience. Religious conservatives wiping their eyes, civil rights activists nodding along, teenagers sitting perfectly still, were absorbing something they had never heard before. When the song ended, Reverend Maddox leaned toward his microphone. "That," he said, "is a gospel song." John looked at him with surprise. "Gospel means good news," Maddox continued. "And good news is what happens when people stop talking past each other and start talking to each other." The applause that followed was different from ordinary concert applause. It was deeper, more sustained. The sound of people who had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. But what made the entire country stop breathing came in the final 15 minutes of the broadcast. Reverend Maddox stood up from his chair. He walked to the edge of the stage. He looked out at the audience with the particular intensity that had made him such an effective preacher for 3 decades. "Last week," he said, "I broke John Lennon's record on television, in front of thousands of people, each because I was angry, because I felt attacked, because I wanted to respond to hurt by causing hurt." He paused. "I was wrong." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a vinyl record, a copy of Revolver, the Beatles' newest album. "This is the same record I broke last week," he said. "I bought it yesterday, and I listened to it, all the way through." He held the record above his head, just as he had done in Lynn Park the previous week. But this time, instead of crushing it, he extended it toward John Lennon. "Music that brings people together," he said, "should not be broken. It should be shared." John stood up from his chair. He walked to where Reverend Maddox stood. He took the record from Maddox's hands, and then, instead of keeping it, he turned to the audience. "Who wants to hear this?" he asked. 1,000 hands went up simultaneously from every section of the auditorium, and religious conservatives and civil rights activists and teenagers and grandparents and everyone in between. John handed the record to someone in the front row. "Pass it around," he said. "Let everyone see it. Let everyone touch it. Let everyone remember that music belongs to all of us." And the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium watched as a Beatles record, the same album that had been burned in their city the previous week, was passed from hand to hand through the entire audience. 4,000 people, each taking a moment to hold the thing that had been destroyed and then redeemed. The television cameras captured all of it: the passing of the record, the faces of people holding it, the moment when it reached the back of the auditorium and began its journey forward again. And across America, in millions of living rooms, people watched something they had never seen before. The opposite of destruction, the opposite of division, the opposite of everything they had been told was inevitable when people disagreed about things that mattered. The Birmingham concert was never officially recorded. No album was released. No bootleg tapes circulated. What happened that evening existed only in the memories of the people who were there and in the brief, inadequate clips that appeared on the evening news. But those memories were powerful, and they spread. Within weeks, similar events began happening in other cities, and public conversations between people who disagreed about important things but were willing to try to understand each other instead of simply defeating each other. Ministers and musicians, politicians and activists, teachers and students. None of them achieved the particular magic of the Birmingham evening, but all of them carried forward something that John Lennon and Reverend Tommy Maddox had demonstrated was possible. The idea that public disagreement did not have to be destructive, and that differences of opinion could be explored rather than weaponized, that the goal of conversation between people who disagreed could be understanding rather than victory. John returned to London and rejoined the Beatles for what would be their final American tour later that year. But something had changed in him during that week in Birmingham. Something had settled. The defensive edge that had characterized his public statements for years had been replaced by something quieter and more generous. He never spoke extensively about the Birmingham evening in interviews. When asked about it, he said simply, "Tommy Maddox taught me that the people who disagree with you most strongly are sometimes the people who care about the same things you care about. They just care about them differently." Reverend Maddox continued preaching at First Baptist Church of Greater Birmingham for another 15 years, but his sermons in the years following the evening with John Lennon had a different quality: less anger, more curiosity, less certainty about who was wrong, more interest in finding out what might be right. He kept the copy of Revolver that John had handed back to him at the end of the evening. He played it regularly, at home, usually in the late evenings when the day's responsibilities were finished and he could listen to it simply as music rather than as a cultural or theological statement. His favorite song was Here, There and Everywhere. He said it reminded him that love was bigger than the categories people used to contain it. Birmingham Municipal Auditorium still stands. It has hosted thousands of concerts, political rallies, graduation ceremonies, and community events. Ian but longtime employees speak of the evening in August 1966 with a particular reverence. They describe a quality of attention in that building that night that they had never experienced before or since. It was like, one usher said many years later, the whole building was listening, not just to what was being said on stage, but to some possibility that nobody had quite imagined before. The possibility that people could choose to understand each other instead of choosing to fight. On December 8, 1980, when John Lennon was murdered in New York City, Reverend Tommy Maddox was one of the first public figures to issue a statement. It was brief. It read, in its entirety, "I lost a friend today. He taught me that the bridge between people who disagree is not compromise. It's compassion. He will be missed by everyone who believes that understanding is more powerful than being right." The record that had been passed through the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium that evening, the copy of Revolver that 4,000 people had held in their hands, was donated to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute after Reverend Maddox's death in 1991. It sits in a display case, accompanied by a small placard that reads, "Music belongs to all of us, and some things are too important to be broken." The official record of that evening is brief. Two men had a conversation. 4,000 people listened. The country watched. What the official record doesn't capture is the sound of a prayer spoken into a microphone by a man who wasn't sure he was doing it right. It doesn't capture the moment when an album that had been burned was passed from hand to hand through an entire auditorium. Nor it doesn't capture the silence that fell over America when people saw two enemies discover they were friends who had been speaking different languages about the same thing. Common ground, the most dangerous discovery in the history of public discourse. Because once you find it, you can't go back to pretending it doesn't exist. The end. If this story about the courage of genuine dialogue, the power of admitting when you're wrong, and the extraordinary grace of choosing understanding over victory moved you, subscribe, and leave that powerful like below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the people who disagree with you most strongly might be the people who care about the same things you do. What conversation in your life do you wish could happen the way this one did? Tell us in the comments below.